Welcome to Case Vault, where every case has a crack, a contradiction, a missed clue, a detail that should not be there. Today we're looking at a man who impersonated more than a dozen professionals, including a Navy surgeon in a war zone, and the one newspaper photo that brought it all down. A warship off the coast of Korea, autumn of 1951. HMCS Cayuga, a Canadian destroyer, pitching on the Yellow Sea. Wounded men are being carried into the sick bay. The ship's surgeon scrubs in canvas, steel, and a single surgical light. He's calm, he's confident. He's already laid out the instruments in the order the manual said he should. The crew trusts him completely. There's one problem. He isn't a surgeon. He isn't a doctor. He's never been to medical school. The night before, he was in the wardroom with a medical textbook, trying to learn what the next morning might demand. His name isn't Dr. Joseph Sear. His name is Ferdinand Waldo Demara. Within the next few hours, according to the surviving accounts, he's going to perform multiple emergency operations on wounded men. One of them involves a bullet extraction near a man's chest. By every version of the story that made it into print, the patients live. Demara was born in December of 1921 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. His father worked in a movie theater. The family had money once, then lost it during the Depression. The boy was bright. Everyone said so. But he couldn't sit still in a classroom. At 16, he ran away from home and showed up at a Trappist monastery. Not to visit, to join. A teenage boy walked into one of the strictest Catholic orders in the world. Silence, fasting, manual labor before dawn, and talked his way through the door. He didn't belong. He hadn't been called. He hadn't finished school. He showed up with a story about wanting to serve God, and the monks took him in. That's the first time the pattern shows itself. A closed institution, a confident story, an open door. Over the next several years, Demara drifted through religious orders, the Trappists, the Brothers of Christian Instruction, calling himself Brother John Payne. He wasn't searching for God, he was searching for a role that fit. None of them did. Not for long. The monasteries gave him something, though. They showed him what it looked like when an institution trusts you on paper. If the robes say you belong, people treat you like you belong. Demara filed that away. In 1941, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. Within a year, he went AWOL under a stolen name, Anthony Ignolia. Then he enlisted in the Navy. Then he faked his own suicide and deserted. The military caught up with him, and he was sentenced to 18 months in a naval disciplinary barracks in San Pedro, California. 18 months in a cell. Most men would have come out quieter. Demara came out with a method. The method was simple. Find a real person with real credentials, someone who won't be in the same room, the same state, or the same country. Copy their papers. Become them. Not a forgery, a replacement. The documents were real. The person presenting them wasn't. That distinction mattered. A forged document could be caught by an expert. A real document with the wrong face behind it could only be caught by someone who knew the right face. And outside the subject's own town, almost nobody did. And it worked. Again and again. He became Dr. Robert Linton French, a psychology professor at a small college. He taught classes. He graded papers. The faculty liked him. Nobody checked his diploma because he carried the right confidence into the right room. He became a deputy sheriff in Washington State. He walked into a Texas prison as an assistant warden and launched a reform program for inmates. He posed as a cancer researcher. Each identity lasted months, sometimes longer. Each time, the pattern repeated. He'd arrive with borrowed credentials. He'd learn fast, faster than anyone expected. He'd be good at the job, sometimes very good. And then, before anyone checked too closely, he'd vanish and become someone else. More than a dozen identities over 2 decades. Monk, professor, sheriff, warden, researcher. He wasn't collecting titles. He was testing how far paper and confidence could carry him. But the next identity, the one that made him famous, was the one that should have been impossible. If the next identity in this list is already pulling you forward, hit subscribe. The turn in this case is about to land, and it starts with a surgical textbook. Sometime around 1950, while posing as Brother John, Demara befriended a Canadian physician named Dr. Joseph Sear, a real doctor practicing in Grand Falls, New Brunswick. Sear had the one thing Demara always needed: credentials that would pass inspection. Demara took copies of Sear's paperwork. He didn't need to invent a doctor from scratch. He needed the documents of a real one. Sear didn't understand what had happened until much later. In March of 1951, a man calling himself Dr. Joseph C. Sear walked into the Royal Canadian Navy recruiting office in St. John, New Brunswick. He presented a physician's credentials. He was commissioned as a surgeon lieutenant. Within weeks, he was assigned to HMCS Cayuga, a tribal-class destroyer headed for the Korean War. Think about that for a moment. A man with no medical training just talked his way into a commission as a naval surgeon aboard a warship sailing into combat. The Royal Canadian Navy gave him a rank, a uniform, and responsibility for a sick bay serving about 190 crewmen. For the first stretch, Demara managed. Ordinary sick calls, minor complaints, seagoing aches, infections, the kind of routine work you can bluff longer than you should. He had manuals, he had medicines, and he had time. But the Cayuga was sailing into a war zone. The ship was operating off the west coast of Korea, supporting coastal operations. Routine wasn't going to last. And then, during operations off Korea, wounded casualties were brought aboard, gunshot wounds, shrapnel, the kind of injuries that need a surgeon, not a man wearing somebody else's credentials. This is the moment the whole story turns. Demara had a choice: refuse to operate and expose himself as a fraud, admit in front of a captain and a crew that every credential he'd shown was somebody else's, or scrub in and bet that the medical texts from the night before, the photographs in the surgical manual, and his own nerve would be enough to keep men alive on an operating table. One choice ends his career and maybe his freedom. The other puts a patient's chest under his hands. He chose the table. He opened the surgical manual. And he operated, not once, according to the most repeated naval account, roughly 16 times. Case after case, gunshot wounds, shrapnel, emergency surgery on a rolling destroyer in a combat zone. The most critical case, by the accounts that survive, involved a man with a bullet lodged near his chest. Demara reportedly stepped out, studied a medical text, then came back and operated. Later retellings say he found the bullet and got it out. The patient lived. However dramatic the surviving versions make it sound, the safe claim is still enough. A fake surgeon performed real emergency work on a warship, and nobody in the room stopped him. According to every available account, every patient Demara operated on survived. Everyone. That's the part even the cautious sources keep repeating. A fraud with no license had just finished emergency surgery in a war zone without losing a patient. Not because it excuses the fraud, it doesn't. But it raises a question the rest of this story can't answer. How does a man with no training get through work that trained surgeons spend years learning? The captain of the Cayuga, Commander James Plomer, was impressed. He praised his ship's surgeon in official dispatches. War correspondents picked up the story. A young Canadian Navy doctor performing heroic surgery off the coast of Korea. The kind of story newspapers love to run. And that's where the crack opens. Because the better Demara performed, the more famous he became. And the more famous he became, the more people saw his face, including one person in Grand Falls, New Brunswick, who knew exactly what Dr. Joseph Sear looked like. The real Dr. Joseph Sear was still in Grand Falls, still practicing medicine, still using his own name. He hadn't gone to Korea. He hadn't joined the Navy. He was right where he'd always been. But his mother opened a newspaper. Her son had been in the news once before, the ordinary small-town paper notice when he set up his practice. This time the story was bigger. A heroic Canadian Navy surgeon under her son's name, in combat, saving lives. She read the headline with the pride any mother would feel, and then she looked at the photograph. The face in the photo wasn't her son's. She knew it instantly. Not the jaw, not the eyes, not a mole she'd kissed 1,000 times when he was a baby. She called him. He contacted the Royal Canadian Navy. Naval headquarters in Ottawa sent a signal to the Cayuga. The wording, according to the Canadian Naval Museum, captain's eyes only. Have reason to believe your medical officer is an impostor. Investigate and report. Your ship's surgeon, the man who just saved lives in your sick bay, is not who he says he is. He isn't a doctor. He isn't Joseph Sear. And every operation he performed without a license, without training, and without authority. Demara was confined to his cabin. For 3 days he denied everything, then he confessed. The man who'd been Dr. Sear on Cayuga admitted he was Ferdinand Waldo Demara, a school dropout from Lawrence, Massachusetts, with a record of military desertion and a string of stolen identities. And here's where the story takes its strangest turn. The Royal Canadian Navy was embarrassed, deeply, publicly embarrassed. A man with no qualifications had served as a commissioned officer and operated on wounded men aboard one of their destroyers. The press already had the story. The world was watching. Their response: nothing, no prosecution, no court-martial, no criminal charges of any kind. A public trial would have meant every surgery reviewed on the stand. Every patient asked whether they consented to being operated on by an impostor. Every officer who had signed off on Demara's commission facing a cross-examination. The Navy did the math and backed away from it. They quietly released Demara, paid him roughly $1,000 in accumulated back pay and service credits, and sent him home. The impostor walked away clean. Put it plainly, a man stole another person's identity, joined a foreign military under false pretenses, and performed unlicensed surgery in a war zone. The institution he fooled preferred a quiet exit to a public trial. In January of 1952, Demara sold his story to Life magazine. The issue ran on January 28th. Overnight, the man who'd spent a decade hiding behind other people's names became the most famous imposter in America. His face was on newsstands everywhere. You'd think fame would end the con. It didn't. Demara kept going. He became Martin Godgart, a schoolteacher in Maine. He taught classes, he coached students, and then a prisoner who recognized his face from the Life cover exposed him. Demara was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in prison. In 1959, a writer named Robert Crichton published The Great Impostor, a biography based on extensive interviews with Demara. It became a bestseller. 2 years later, in 1961, Hollywood turned it into a film starring Tony Curtis. The man who couldn't stop pretending to be other people was now being played by a movie star. And then he stopped running. In his later years, Demara worked in pastoral care at Good Samaritan Hospital in Anaheim, California. Not as a surgeon, not as a professor. As a man sitting with the dying, talking to patients, offering presents instead of credentials. No stolen papers. No borrowed robes, just a chair beside a bed and time. It was, by the accounts of the people who worked with him, the one job where the confidence matched the man. When the hospital discovered his past, the chief of staff vouched for him. Demara stayed. It was his most honest role, and the one he kept the longest. He worked there until diabetes forced him to stop in 1980. The disease took both his legs. On June 7, 1982, Ferdinand Waldo Demara died of heart failure in Anaheim, California. He was 60 years old. The man who'd been a monk, a professor, a sheriff, a warden, a surgeon, a teacher, and a chaplain was, finally, no one. If you've been here since the Wardroom textbook, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a like. Let's close the case. There's a question this case leaves behind, and it's not whether Demara was a criminal. He was. He stole identities, defrauded institutions, and put lives at risk. That's the record. The question is harder than that. Demara could learn any job well enough to fool the people doing it for real. He could teach. He could administer a prison. He could perform surgery under fire. The competence was genuine. The identity wasn't. He was everyone and no one. A man who could become anybody except the person he was born as. The one identity he couldn't hold was his own. A school dropout from Lawrence, Massachusetts, who found every door in the world easier to open under somebody else's name, and the only door that had ever closed on him was the one with his real name on it. A textbook in a wardroom, lives on the table, and a mother who opened the wrong newspaper. That's the case. If you see things other people miss, hit subscribe. Case Vault drops a new one twice a week, and the next crack is sharper than this one.